Oh hello, in this video I'll show you how to build what I'm calling a people in a room counter. Use it to count up when people or things go between the sensors and then count down when they pass back through. So let's get started. So I'm going to build this on Vero as I usually do. I've already cut this piece of Vero. This is 5 high and 14 across. As always, when I show these boards on these tutorials, the underside of the boards is the top side of the board rotated that way round. And you can see that represented in the graphics that I'll show up here. So the first thing I'm going to do is prepare the board for the LEDs by cutting a couple of tracks. On the other side of the board, I want to come down one row and come in 2 and cut the third one there, like so. The one to the right of it, like that. And then the one below that one. I'll just go over those again, just to make sure they're nice and clean. As always, old toothbrush, just to clean out any debris. And there you go. So that's those 3 cuts made. Tidy up here. Put that to one side a second while I'll show you the LEDs. Now these are 5mm LEDs, they're infrared, they're 940 nanometers, and like with all LEDs, when you buy them new, you've got a long and a short lead. The short lead also lines up with a flat spot on the case. Now that is your 0 volts or negative, and we're going to take that into account when we place this on the board. On the board itself, we'll turn this back over that way, so remember I've cut the 2 horizontal there and the 2 vertical there, so I'm going to rotate that back over. Now with the first LED, I'm going to put the flat spot, or the short leg, on the right. So I'm going to come down one row and then come in one row. So we'll solder that one in. Now I'm just going to splay these legs out, just to hold the LED while I solder this one in. So this is not going to be flat, not really bothered at the moment, so I'm just going to put a blob of solder on there to hold that leg. That'll hold it while I just put a bit of pressure on, push down, and then just reflow that, and that'll make sure that it's sitting in flat, so we can do the other one now. And again, I'm just going to make sure that's nice and flat on those, just by reflowing the solder and putting a little bit of pressure with my thumb. Okay, that's those 2 done. I'm going to cut those legs off now. I'm going to save these legs, because I will be using them in a second. So we'll save those. Now the other LED, I'm going to put the short leg, or the flat spot, facing the LED that I've just put in. So they're pretty much mirrored to each other. So this first one has got the flat spot to the right, and the second one has got the flat spot to the left. Same thing again, we'll just splay those legs out a little bit, just to hold it there while we do the first one, like so. And I'm just going to push that in and make sure that's flat against the board. And I'm just going to solder the second leg. Okay, that's good. We'll cut those legs off. Again, I'm going to keep those. I will need a couple at least. Now the final thing we need to do with these LEDs is the 2 outside ones are going to be plus volts. The 2 inside ones are the negative, and they need to be connected together. So I'm just going to put a blob of solder between those 2 just to join them together. Like so. Okay, right, so next thing I need to do is connect the 2 outsides together, and to do that, I'm going to take one of the LED legs that I've cut off, and then I'm just going to bend it 90 degrees, like that. And then on my boards, I'm going to come down one, and put that through there. And then we'll solder that on. Now obviously I've done this before, but if you want to hold that leg in, a bit of blue tack on the other side will hold that in, or a bit of tape if you haven't got blue tack. Back on the other side, I want this to line up with the LED leg this side, so that's 3 holes away. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to lift that up a little bit. I'm going to get the leg, and I'm going to line my tweezers up, the outside of the tweezers with the hole there. I'm going to lift it up and bend it, and then I can poke that through there, like so. And then we've got a connection between those 2. And we'll solder that one on now. And then we can trim those legs off. So that's pretty much all the board done. Next thing I need to do is put a resistor in, just to limit the current a little bit. I want these LEDs as bright as possible. So let's put a series resistor in there. Now the resistor I'm going to be using is a 22 ohm resistor. So I'm just going to bend that leg like that. I'm going to make this vertical. So with the legs bent over, I'm going to come in from the first hole there underneath the LED to the hole on the bottom track. So I'm just going to put that through that one and bridge it across those. Now with my tweezers, I'm just going to make that a little bit squarer, like so. So once again, I'll splay the legs out and we'll solder that on. So let's do that bottom one first. So that's that one on, that's good. And then we'll solder that second leg on there. And we'll just cut those off. So that's the board for the LEDs. We've got 2 LEDs there, and then the bottom side looks like the graphic that I've got up there. So the next thing we need to do is make the 2 receivers for the other side. This is going to be the receiver side, and the first thing I'm going to do is put a bridging wire across 2 of these tracks. Now I'm going to grab another one of these LED legs, Same thing again, bend one edge 90 degrees. So for this one, I'm going to come in one and down one again. And put that in there. I think for this, I will use a bit of blue tack. I just don't have enough hands. So that's soldered in that side. Get rid of the tack now. And then back on the top, I'm going to leave 3 holes, and I want to go into the 4th one. So I'm just going to lift that up like we did before. 1, 2, 3, 4th one. I'm going to bend that up. And we'll drop that in there. So I'm going to solder that on. It's a bit ratty at the moment, but what I'm going to do is I'm going to solder that in here. I'm just going to push it down and then reflow that solder. And you see there, it jumped. And now it's nice and flat. I'm going to take another leg. Same thing again. Bend it 90 degrees. And then this one's going to go same again, but shifted over one. That's going to go in there like that. Again, we'll take a blue tack. It's a bit fiddly, this. Let's lift that up a little bit. I want the 1, 2, 3, 4th hole. I'm just going to bend that and poke it through there. So I've got 2 almost parallel straight lines. They're sticking up. We're not too bothered about that one for the moment. So just using the blue tack now just to hold everything horizontal on the desk. So I'm going to solder that on. And like I did before, I'm just going to push that in and then reflow that solder. So they're both set reasonably flat. And we'll trim those off. Next job is the sensors. Now these again are tuned to the wavelength almost. These are 940, these are 950. They're close enough, but they also got infrared filters on, so they will cut out like normal light. And they're tuned to the frequency that we're going to flash these at, so you shouldn't get too much interference from external sources. So I'm going to put 2 of these side by side. Now I'm going to put these flat against the board. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take my pliers and I'm going to come in about, I want these roughly there, so there looks good. I'm just going to come down a little bit more and I'm going to bend that over 90 degrees, like so. And then on the top side of the board, I'm going to miss a hole there, and on the bottom row, put this one in there, like so. So the middle pin lines up with that solder joint there. So again, I'm just going to splay these off a little bit, quite a bit actually, just to hold that. I'm not too worried about the orientation of that just yet. Again, I'm going to use my blue tack just to hold the board horizontal. And I'm going to solder this middle pin in. So blubber solder on my iron, and then we'll just put a blubber solder on that center one there. Make sure the track's nice and warm as well. And let's do the other 2. Okay, so I'll do the same thing for the other one. And then I'm going to leave a hole and go into the next 3. Okay, that's the sensor or transmitter and receiver boards done. Hopefully yours looks similar to mine. Couple of more things to do. We'll split the boards and we'll add some wires to them. Vero board is fairly easy to cut. We just need a reasonably sharp knife. I've just got a standing knife here, and I'm going to cut down that center row of holes there. So what you want to do, top tip, is do a light cut just to score it. We'll do this both sides. And then we're going to gradually increase the pressure just a little bit every time. We only want to slice through a little bit of the board, because once that's cut, it will snap quite nicely. So there you go. That's cut there. And for the receiver board, I'm just going to cut that row off there, because that fits in with my 3D printer. And you just want to nibble this. You don't want to cut it all in once because it will split. I'm going to do the same for this one. I'm just going to cut it down. Just nibble away. One of those little cross pieces at a time. There you go. I've got 2 nice little boards all ready for our wires. For the wires, the transmitter, which is the 2 LEDs there, I'm going to use some of this silicone wire. It comes paired, and you're going to need quite a length for this. This is going to go around the door or across the aperture that you want these sensors to be across. Now for the LEDs, I'm going to turn this over that way and solder onto the undersides. And then to make my life a little bit easier, we'll get the blue tack out again. I'm quite enjoying using this. So on the underside of the board, I want a connection here. So I'm going to put a nice blob of solder there. And then that's the bottom of that resistor on there. The plus side is going to go there. And then negative is going to go on that one. So there you go. That's the connections made for the LEDs or the transmitter board. Next up, we'll do this one. So we've got the top side of the board. We'll rotate it over that way, and we'll mash that down into our blue tack. With power, 0 volts, and our signal. And remember, we put those wires across, so the power goes to here, 0 volts goes to there, so this one's powered as well from this side. So we just need a yellow wire on the signal out of this one. So I'm going to put a blob of solder on that one, and then the yellow wire goes on there. So looking at the top side of the board, we'll rotate that back over that way. And from right to left, we've got plus volts, 0 volts, signal 1, and signal 2. So I'll do a quick check with the magnifying glass, make sure none of those tracks are shorted across. Looks good to me. Okay, so that's our transmitter done with the long leads. That's our receivers done with the short leads, because that will go right next to the ESP32 and the control box. And this one needs to go around or across the frame. You want the beam brake to span. Now that we're ready to connect the sensors to the board, I've made a couple of updates to the receiver here. So before we had the red and black wires here, which means I've got 3 wires this side, and then the yellows all the way over here. So because these are joined together, and those are those LED legs that we used on the boards, it just makes all these wires nice and neat. And I've also gone and threaded it through one of my 3D printed mounts before connecting it to the board, and we'll get to that in a second. It sits inside that way up. We've got a wall mount this side, the wires come out the back, and then we have a nice little shroud that just slides over there, and it's a friction fit. So we'll hot glue that in a minute and put the case on. And I've done the same for the emitters. I've just threaded that through the back of one of these cases, and again, this has a top so the LEDs can shine through it. We'll put those together and we'll talk about the connections to the board next. Now that they're glued in, we can put the cases back on. And the receivers, looking like something out of Star Wars there. These are wall mountable this way round, so you can put it on the inside or the outside of the door. It doesn't matter which way up these go. As long as these two are facing each other, then it's fine. So I've already connected these to the boards. Now the LEDs themselves, they need to come off of a GPIO pin, and you'll see why when I talk about the code a little bit more. So this is coming off the 0 volts there on this side, and GPIO 32. As for the receivers, we've got 4 wires coming off of here. These do need to be powered all the time. So here I've come off of 3.3 volts and ground for the red and black. And then the 2 outputs from the sensors, they're going on to 18 and 19. So the only other thing I've done here, I've cut the tracks between left and right. And I staggered them because, makes a nice pattern. Also, you'll notice something else is soldered in here. Well, underneath the board, I put a couple of LEDs. Now, these are used to line up the sensor and the emitter. It's not really critical. You will get quite a range on this thing, but it's always best to have some sort of indication for when these are lined up. So when they're lined up, both them LEDs will come on. And I put these underneath the board so it's not always shining when you don't need to see them. And all I've done here is a couple of 3mm LEDs. The negative of each one comes off the 18 and 19 here. So if we look at the underside of the board, we can see they're connected to the 18 and 19, which is our yellow and white wires there. And then I've just used a 470 ohm resistor between the positive leg of the LED and our 3.3 volts down here at the bottom there. Remember, that's the last one on that board there, 3.3 volts. Another thing to note, I'm using sockets here. I didn't have the full range socket. This particular board has 30 pins on it, so 15 each side. So what I did was I used the sockets from the D1 Minis. So I've got an 8-way there and a 7-way because I need 15 pins. To get a 7-way, I just cut the end off there, and then I filed it down with a bit of sandpaper on a block. So you can see there that it's separated. And if you look really closely, that's really sanded right down so it fits in. Otherwise, there's too much of a gap and it'll bend the board and these won't line up properly. So once they're filed down, you'll get a nice even spacing for the pins. So yeah, that's the hardware done. Now, you're not going to believe how ridiculously simple this code is, but let's get into it anyway. So as always, I'm using substitutions. We've got 2 items in the substitutions. We've got the kitchen name. This is, as it says here, is for the entities. That could be capital letters, not a problem. We've also got brightness. Now, that's the brightness for these LEDs. And one thing to note is that the LEDs are using PWM signals. Now, at 100% brightness, there's no PWM signal, which means that the LEDs are on constantly. As I mentioned earlier, these receivers need a 38 kilohertz signal so that they can reject sunlight, bright lights, etc. So obviously, these LEDs are strobing at 38 kilohertz. So we can't have 100% because they wouldn't strobe. The main reason I'm using the brightness control in the substitutions is these LEDs are quite bright. So if you're going to make a smaller aperture, then you need to drop the brightness. And I found that 10% will get you down to about here without blowing out the sensors. 70% that I've used here is pretty much what I used in the demo. So in my demo, I used a brightness of 70%, and the maximum distance I had between these was the width of my desk. It was about 49 inches or 125 centimeters, so well over a meter between these two, and it worked absolutely fine. Next up, we've got some standard boilerplate with the ESP Home. Again, I've taken the name from the YAML file and put it in here. It's obviously an ESP32. Next job is to, when it boots, is to turn the LEDs on all the time. So basically on boot, then turn on the LED ID, which we'll see in a minute, and then the brightness. And obviously the brightness there, I'm using a substitution, which is this word here. As you can see, I'm using a rotary encoder. Let's talk a little bit about rotary encoders. So you can use them for selecting stuff on a rotary dial or any other bidirectional sensors. Now the way these work, it's got two pins. You've got an A pin and a B pin. Now in my setup, I've got the A pin on 18, I've got the B pin on 19, and the sensors basically will give a high when there's light and a 0 volts or low when there's no light. Now, a normal hardware rotary encoder, if you turn it in one direction, let's call this one forward or clockwise, what happens is in the actual rotary encoder body itself, it will take the A pin to high, keep it high, so as you continue in time, the B pin will come on. So the next step, if you like, is A and B both on. The next stage, if you keep on rotating, is A goes off, then B goes off, and then the whole cycle repeats as you turn it. For a backwards rotation, the B pin comes on first, then the A pin comes on, so they're both on at the same time. Then B goes off, then A goes off. And the way I've set up these sensors is that the light is on all the time. You can see that both LEDs there, which are the outputs from the sensors, are on. So I'm using that so we can line up the sensors. So on the graph, we're starting here. So if A goes off first, i.e. the first beam is broken on pin 18, then we know that we're going in this direction. However, if B gets broken first, pin 19, we know we're going in the opposite direction. When you first boot up, Home Assistant, unless it gets a signal from the rotary encoder, it will see the device as unavailable, or the sensor. A little workaround, a little hack there. I've set the rotary encoder to 1, then immediately set it to 0. That way the Home Assistant sensor gets a signal of 0. Otherwise the rotary encoder won't send out anything, so it won't send out a 0. We've got normal Wi-Fi, API and logger. Put your own API and OTA passwords in here if you need it. We'll get back to the rotary encoder in a second. We'll just scroll down. I've got two other items here. The LED. We're using a monochromatic light. Obviously it's infrared, it's only one wavelength. I've given it a name, which I've used elsewhere in the code. Default transition, not really necessary, but I put that in there for completeness. And then finally, we've got the output for this LED, and I'm using LED C, which is the ESP32 version, GPIO 32, as shown on the board we had earlier. And like I say, these receivers need a 38 kilohertz frequency, and that's one of the reasons why I didn't use a D1 Mini. D1 Mini is not quite fast enough in both the signal here and receiving the data from these sensors. So above that, we've got a binary sensor. Now there's two outputs coming from this sensor. First one is number of people in the room. So every time someone walks in and out, there's a tally of the number of people in the room. And you could use that in your automations, or if you want to count something in and out, you can use that number. But just to make it nice and easy, when there are people in the room, this binary sensor switches on. When there's no one in the room, this binary sensor gets switched off. And I've brought that in one of my control panels. So we've got the number of people here. This is an automation on a button, but you get these two sensors coming in. So we've got the occupied, which is this binary sensor here. And then I've got the kitchen occupancy number of people. So as people come into the room, you can see this has changed. It's now detected. And we've got number of people in the room. So if we had more people in the room, we can see them coming in. So we've got 7 people. And then as 7 people leave the room, or 7 items go past the sensor, last one goes to 0, turns this off. And of course, if everything gets confused, you've got the reset button here, which will reset everything. And that reset button is a template button, and it's just basically a button called Reset Occupancy Device Name, which in our case is Kitchen. And all that does, the same as the on boot, it resets the rotary encoder that I've called Door to 0. Now the rotary encoder itself is a fairly simple bit of code. It just needs 2 inputs, which is A and B. And remember, put the sensor on 18 and 19. There's also a reset pin. I've set this to GPIO 13. I've just used GPIO 13, same size as the LED. That way you can use a hardware button to reset something. So rather than going to your control panel to hit the reset button, you can have a manual switch somewhere near this sensor, just in case it gets confused. So the automation on this rotary encoder is an on value. And all this is doing is looking at the value. So if the value, we've got an if then condition, a lambda, return the value x. As you've seen in previous tutorials, the value of x is an internal variable for the sensor that it's attached to. So in this case, this will be the rotary encoder value. And this can be either a positive or a negative. So all this condition is doing is saying if the value of the rotary encoder, x, is greater than or equal to 1, i.e. one person has entered the room, then do something. And the then do something we want to do is the switch, and we want to turn that switch to true or on. And that published state there is for the switch, and if we scroll down we can see the switch is the binary sensor for the occupancy. And if we go back to our control panel, that's this one here. So if we look at that, that comes in as binary sensor, kitchen occupied, which is the same here. Binary sensor, name, substitution, kitchen occupied. So that's the name of that one. So that turns that switch on if the output of this rotary encoder is equal to or greater than 1. And then we just use a simple else. So anything else, do the opposite thing, we turn that same switch off. So that's pretty much it. A very simple bit of coding to do some fairly complicated automations. As always with my code, the only thing you need to worry about is these two values here. Make sure that that is the same as that. Save and then install. Well, I hope this video was helpful with your projects. Please do share it so others can find it as well. I upload videos whenever I can, so subscribe and hit the bell icon to get notified. That's it. Thanks for watching.
Okay, I love you. Bye-bye.